Hi everybody!
There's something special about the Trails games. It's really hard to define if you haven't played them, but I'm going to do my best with this video. I'll also try to convince you to get into the franchise while also explaining where you should start. Chapters will be used, so you can jump around as needed. When it comes to media, the word epic is overused, however that is literally the best way to define the Legend of Heroes, or as it's becoming more known as, the Trails series. Why is it so epic though? This comes down to the fact the narrative is effectively one long epic. If we compare it to literature, then I'd say it's akin to either the Odyssey or Beowulf. In terms of anime, it's like Dragon Ball or One Piece. But what about film? In that sense, it's like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, before it went to shit. Have I convinced you as to why it's special yet? Which brings us to our next point, where should you start? For this segment, I'll give an overview of where you can start before breaking down how I would go about it were I to start over. But for all of the Trails veterans watching this video, where did you start and what are your fondest memories with the franchise to date? Sound off in the comments. So there are effectively a few options as to where you can start, and each one is the start of its respective arc. Like I said in the previous segment, this franchise is like an epic, and it's thanks to the games being so interconnected that we have such a grandiose story. So the starts for each arc are as follows: Trails in the Sky, Trails from Zero, Trails of Cold Steel, and Trails Through Daybreak. You'd have some distinct advantages and disadvantages if you were to start with the later arcs. I listed them off in order. But if you want grittier storytelling that explores morality and ethics, then you're best served by starting with either Zero or Daybreak. With Daybreak being the latest subseries to come out, it has the most refined graphics to date, unless of course we discount the upcoming Trails in the Sky remake, but more on that later. But it also has the most updated and refined gameplay. Zero, on the other hand, offers charming pixel art for the graphics and feels like an old-school JRPG, because it is. It, along with its sequel, Trails to Azure, are also just one side of the coin, as the first two Cold Steel entries take place mostly concurrently to the Crossbell duology, so you can almost pick your poison between the two. You'll just miss out on some references. Trails of Cold Steel is where I started, and I didn't have the benefit of starting with the Crossbell games. I also wouldn't have had access to all three of the Sky games either, as Western PSP and Vita owners never had the opportunity to acquire the third game. If you wanted to play the Sky trilogy, you'd need a PC, which greatly hampered accessibility for the starting arc. That is still the case. However, if you want to just blitz through the whole franchise in order during the lead up to Trails Beyond the Horizon releasing during the early stages of next year, you can totally do that. But like I said, the Sky First Chapter Remake really throws an interesting wrinkle into the equation. Especially once you factor in, we know we will for sure see a remake for Second Chapter, because Kondo-san finally said the quiet part out loud. It literally makes no sense to release the remake of Sky First Chapter without also releasing Second Chapter in the very near future, for the simple fact the first game ends on a massive cliffhanger, when previously he said we'd only get future remakes if the first game sold well enough. So I would say it's a safe bet to make that Sky Third Chapter will not be all that far behind Second, since that does kind of set up a lot of the future arcs. I'd also argue that means we could see remakes for Zero and Azure in the next handful of years, especially when you consider Falcom have most of the assets required to do said remakes. As much as I love this company, they really don't hide the fact they do reuse assets a lot of the time. So let's get to my opinion on where you should start this franchise. So like I said earlier in the video, you can kind of start with any of the first entries for a respective arc, though you will miss out on a lot of the juicy little story details, which is kind of what makes this franchise so special. When I've discussed the matter in previous videos, I've said you can pretty much start with whatever games have a setting you're interested in, Liberl or Erebonia if you're more interested in traditional coming-of-age stories, Or on the other hand, you could go for Zero or Daybreak if you want more mature themes. But as I've thought about the matter, I honestly think you should throw my previous advice out the window. As much as I love the characters and their arcs from the Crossbell, Erebonian, and Calvard sagas, I honestly feel you'd be doing yourself a massive disservice by not just hopping on with the Skyforce Chapter Remake, and here's why. The graphics engine has been so finely tuned that this is literally the best looking Falcom game you can get. It's also fairly accessible, being on Switch, PS5, and PC, meaning you pretty much have zero excuse to not pick it up. Also, when you consider this is literally the best starting point possible, as it's the first game in the franchise, you'll get all of the story beats instead of getting them piecemeal. Plus, the gameplay is the best and most refined it has ever been, even if Trails into Reverie still remains my favorite entry in the franchise to date. But honestly, if I could turn back time, this is where I would start, since it also gives you the opportunity to wait and catch up to the stories that have yet to be told. But if I'm being honest, I'm also very glad I started with Trails of Cold Steel for the Vita back in the day. It was the right game at the right time for me, as I heavily identified with Rean as a character, and I also needed to experience his story to get myself on the right track. It's because of Rean's journey that I decided I wanted to be a content creator. Well, that and the pandemic also meant I was kind of out of a job. But I wanted to share my love for Falcom games with the internet via Twitch. Then my Twitch community noticed I'm an opinionated asshole, which led to me developing the heelish character you sometimes see on this platform.
Oops, I'm breaking the fourth wall.
I did just break kayfabe there, but it was to illustrate that some of what I'm saying on this platform is to get a rise out of people, even if I do believe a lot of it. This is mostly because people painted me as a jackass in the early days of the channel, and I just gave the audience what they wanted. Basically, a lot of what I say is my opinion, it's just embellished a little bit. But yeah, this world and franchise is super special to me, and I want people to have the best possible experience with it, even if some of the fanbase is
stupid, full of shit, and fucking nuts!
But yeah, if you want to start, just start with the Sky Remake. You won't regret it. But if you've made it this far, please hit the subscribe button. I really want this franchise to reach more people, as I think it could be as life-changing for them as it was for me. Also, if you're on mobile and are hyped for the future of the Trails franchise, hit the hype button, as it'll really help get this video in front of more people. Now check out one of my many Trails videos appearing on screen now, and keep blazing your own trail.